Some games want to entertain us, but other games want to immerse us in a living and breathing world. What makes a game world feel real?
Welcome to the Gentleland show, where we talk about game development, design, and culture. It's your access to all things in the games industry. We are your guides.
Hey everyone, I'm Sam, a business and marketing expert and a co-founder at Gentleland.
I'm Edwin, a composer, sound designer, and opera singer.
Hey, I'm Jacky, founder of Gentleland, computer scientist, and digital artist.
I didn't understand world building as a term for most of my life. I think the first time I heard it was from my best friend in high school, when he was wanting to be a science fiction writer. He said that before you write anything, you have to build a world that your story lives in. In a sense, like write an encyclopedia that explains everything in that world down to the smallest level of detail. Then you write your story in a small corner of that world. So there's no plot point, loopholes, things like that really get missed in the creative development process. I never really understand or even was introduced to the concept of world building until then. And now in the context of video games, I see it all around us.
In gaming, we immediately think about what makes a game world feel real. And for me, it's multiple things, starting with the world's history. What feels older than you? What feels older than the player, you know? Great worlds don't just start with the players. They feel like they have existed before you. They have histories, they have culture, conflicts, and everything existed before you. And you're not just, like the world doesn't start with you. Dark Souls does this really well. It just, like you have all these runes, you have cryptic dialogue, and items and descriptions. You have to piece everything together. That partly only works so well because there is a world prior existing to the player experience. Another one are worlds that shape the world's logic. These are really interesting pieces where every world has kind of its own rules, whether it's physics, magic, or even just the way people behave, people talk, when they're talking a certain way, have like their own culture and all of these things that just shape everything. I'm just thinking about Witcher, the world there where you have monsters, politics, and everything kind of coexists in this really messy environment, I almost want to say. And there's a real way on how the world reacts to all of these choices that make it feel more than just fantasy.
I remember being very impressed and maybe thinking this sounds like a very long way of writing a story, but J.R. Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, and apparently he built boxes, just boxes and boxes of lore about his world. And in a way, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and I think there's another book called Silmarillion, but famous books are just like a small niche. They're just a small corner. It's like, similarly in a game, you should be feeling, if you're truly immersed in a very well-built world, that you're just kind of touching the surface. You're just forging your own path in this pre-existing world. So like Jacky said, it's there before you arrived, and it'll be there afterwards. You've had your little moment that has influenced that world. You are not the world. So to me, it's a just really interesting question to ask what decisions actually make a game feel like they are a living, breathing place. It's easy to say that, we need all this lore in the background. Actually, what lore gets used? How do people decide when is enough lore enough, or what lore they need to put in, or when they're overwhelming the player with just all of these lore drops? So how do we interest and immerse a player in a whole culture without specifically telling them they're in that culture? And for me, especially interesting, actually, if your game's in a real world setting, how do you decide what you need to tell the player to feel like they're in that culture? And how do you decide what you're going to ignore? Because, for example, I live in London. You can't just put London in a game. That is at least not yet possible.
Why not? I'm thinking about Assassin's Creed.
I think it would be kind of difficult just to build me, get an AI just to do me, because I'd be there, obviously.
Of course.
We need Edwin standing on a street corner.
Yeah, running late for a train or something.
No, when I think of world building, then I often don't think about games themselves, but about game development as well. So interwoven with level design and storytelling, and via extension, environmental storytelling. I remember how I once went down a rabbit hole researching ships and large cruises and how they're produced and specifically built for commercial use, just for a project where it was basically an environment on a cruise ship. I start usually to nerd out about these things so much that I then know every small detail around cruise ships. I annoyed my whole team to pieces, I'm sure. Maybe I have like this technical basis then for the visual development of a game, but for the player, it's maybe not that noticeable. But I always felt that when you have that knowledge, you can make every story or every world even that much more special. You have all these tools suddenly in your hand of making the world or shaping the world that your player goes through. So when I'm thinking of that cruise ship, which was like a post-apocalyptic scenario, right? You could then suddenly develop or invent your own ideas in that world with the limitations that world also brings, right? So in that specific world we were crafting, you would have no wood, for example. You would only have certain metals because everything else was missing out of the world. And from these limitations, you then suddenly also have very interesting scenarios that happen, because then you certainly need to think out of the box of, okay, what happens if something really important that we are using for everyday buildings is missing? And as a visual designer, you then also notice, wow, it's becoming very difficult to create a certain atmosphere that you maybe want to evoke. So you need to find other ways to create that atmosphere.
In kind of like world building basics in video games, I'm always thinking about some of the first worlds I've encountered playing video games. Legend of Zelda is the one that comes to mind for me. And as a game compared to all the other arcade games or all the other early console games, The Legend of Zelda definitely created a world much better than all these other games created. You literally are in a place called the overworld, and there's labyrinths in the underworld, and there's an environment and water and trees and mountains and rocks and all these different things in that gameplay space. What I thought was interesting is as it became more popular and the lore and all the sequels were made, everything about that world expanded. And so I always wonder if the developers expected world building kind of in those early games to be thrown away, or they were like, oh wow, this franchise is now kind of popular, and now I have to kind of shoehorn more story because it's becoming a great success, that they have backfill in these plot points. So I'm kind of not really sure. Also, from kind of like originally what we're talking about, are devs still building out the world completely before they start on development of the game? So I'm not really sure. I do feel like Super Mario, there was definitely no world building, no plot points there, that they definitely built it by Super Mario 3, Super Mario World, and onward.
There was a tweet not so long ago where I think Nintendo was happy to double down kind of semi-officially on a Legend of Zelda timeline, but that had not existed until actually a fan base kind of said, well, surely this is the timeline, right? This is the only path that makes sense. And they're like, yeah, it works, but that's fine. So they're actually, as far as I'm aware, until that tweet, there wasn't even any semi-official acknowledgement of any sort of timeline in these games. But yeah, there's all of these different approaches to world building, and I think the Legend of Zelda series is masterful at just implying. They're masters of inspire curiosity. They don't have to tell you everything about their world to make you feel like you're in that world, and actually to make you want to know more about the world. Because a lot of these games are, Metroidvanias. They're about exploration, trying to get these items that will help you advance. So even the gameplay mechanics are kind of inherently curious. You want to explore. And I think other games that did that really well for me would include Guild Wars. That's a MMORPG actually, but it was massive. There were large explorable areas, and a lot of them didn't really have any or much purpose in any main quest lines. Sometimes the loot wasn't even that good. They were just actually neutral, kind of somewhat empty spaces. There'd be some lore, and you'd be rewarded with, a cool poem that you find in the sand or something. I remember I was exploring that game to get a cartography title, which is just a prestige title about exploring the game. And I stumbled on this really awesome undead dragon boss called Rotscale, and I didn't know he existed. Like a lot of players would have already known. They would have just heard somebody mention Rotscale, but this dragon was like a way higher level than you'd expect in that area, surrounded by these undead guards and with a kind of temple around him, and it really felt like there was a whole story happening there, and it's definitely not in the game's main plot line, but even just that made me feel like this game is full of these cool little secrets, and it's rewarding exploration. So that world building doesn't even have to happen explicitly. Like Jacky was saying, we're so strongly aware of art styles, architecture, tropes, and a whole bunch of subconscious stuff that we actually really quickly and subconsciously sometimes absorb to just feel like, okay, this is a consistent world. These tropes are telling me this is what this world feels like, and I kind of understand where I am.
I worry that a lot of video game devs stress out about sales, and because, a game needs to be received well from a commercial standpoint, world building might get deprioritized in the development process. And, while some games are just kind of fun on their own, they don't really need a backstory to give it purpose to the mechanics. Other games end up cramming so much of the backstory in the game that I feel like developers are forcing it because the game itself is just kind of bad. I don't want to call out any games in particular, but you know it when you play one of those kind of games, like where the story elements are just tedious and you wish you didn't have to go through certain mechanics just to play the ones you like.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's that kind of game where you venture upon the forge of Endosiliath, and in there the rings of Asbayornoquath are made. And it's like, it's completely irrelevant. It's just people just dropping names and places. It's just not.
It just gives you +1 to luck, and you're like, oh wow, thanks for nothing.
Okay. But yeah, I'm also a big fan of this show don't tell, which is a classic like filmmakers tenet of filmmakers. And I've seen in game design teams a common mistake where they think that world building just comes from having a massive amount of lore and backstory. And especially if it's complicated lore, that must be good, right? Because the conversation took an hour to ratify exactly what that lore is. But in most cases, actually, I don't want to read a novel while I'm gaming. That's not why I'm gaming. So a skillfully designed game reveals a lot of this information just through symbols. And whether we're aware of it or not, we are really good at picking up on these kind of cues, like somebody's dress or architecture, even things like flora and fauna. If you want to make a place feel hot, put some palm trees and cactuses in it. You could be in a city, but if they're growing, it's a hot city. Things like visible traditions, foreign languages can sound pretty cool within a game, made-up ones. They just add depth and richness to a game's culture and experience without telling you that depth and richness is there. And the culture feels real because you can see it, that culture being represented in your landscape.
It's years and years since Skyrim released, and why do people still talk about the game? I wonder. And I believe it's because it's not just the dragons, it's the mundane details. You just mentioned books, right? So you can read books in Skyrim and you listen to all these side conversations between NPCs, or, like this very famous I took an arrow to the knee kind of conversation piece that went so viral at the time. These tiny stories hidden in these games, they're telling you so much more around the world, right? Because in Skyrim, taking an arrow to the knee, the whole mythology around, what he actually meant was that he got married is just so mind-blowing when you understand then suddenly the context, right? And I feel Hollow Knight does that really well. It's filled with these different mysterious structures that really hint at a lost civilization. Breath of the Wild, like this climbing mechanic where you can just reach mountaintops and look over the entire world. They really then just feel bigger than the main story, I want to say. It's something that just pulls you in deeper. Exploration games in general, I feel, do that pretty well.
The two most forgettable games I played in recent years, I actually put decent hours into it. One of them was Fable 2, and the other one was Dragon Age, and it was so forgettable. I don't even know which Dragon Age. Look, nothing against these two beloved franchises, but I think part of that was because I could not understand anything that was going on in any of these games. And like, I get it, you're a hero, you go do something, but other than that, I have no idea what Fable was about, and I had no idea why it was called Dragon Age. Maybe there was some dragons in it. I just remember wanting to play an RPG and just kind of like hacking and slashing my way through both of those titles. I didn't even know how things worked. Like, I was like, cool, a mechanic of skills. I just kind of spammed it. I didn't care for any of the characters, didn't care for any of the storylines. I just cheesed the whole game, kind of just like leveled up fast, defeated monsters, moved on with my life. It was really the most unserious I have ever played a game. What's ironic is till this day, I still have no idea what those two games are about. I just remember random scenes where I was just kind of button mashing a boss. I don't really know if it was the world building or the game itself, because people love, like I said, people love those two franchises. People love those games. They thought they were really great at the time. I can say with some confidence that it wasn't the world building, because people still have lots of fans for those games. Maybe it was just the games themselves, maybe it was just something that I just couldn't really get into because it was my personal play style or gameplay style that just didn't jive with the mechanics.
I've struggled to find someone who thinks the same about Dragon Age for years, because I have the exact same issue with Dragon Age, but I could never put a finger on it. Fable 2, I really like the mechanic about, being able to develop your character a bit more, because I feel that was kind of like a unique angle at the time. But Dragon Age, it didn't stand the vibe check for some reason. And I feel like a world can be beautiful, but it doesn't connect with you, the player, then it's just a backdrop. And I felt really strongly that was the case in Dragon Age. World building, to me, is more than just aesthetics, it's storytelling without words. And it's really easy to mistake world building for just maps, lore, and visual design. And true world building isn't about decorations, it's about creating an ecosystem where everything, places, people, mechanics, feel interconnected. I once heard a smart saying, if a game's world looks good but lacks depth, it becomes a theme park. This is to me such a really good example, because when done right, the world you create for a game becomes its own character almost.
I think some games that don't tell a concrete story or plot, I've heard people being quite positive about the story that Little Nightmares is telling, for example. I played Little Nightmares 2. I don't think it had much, if any, dialogue. I don't think it had much, if any, of a sense of objective plot. But the game is full of symbols, and it kind of suggests an archetypal plot where you, as the player, can just fill in the gaps for yourself. So it's just trying to capture the imagination, and again, it's just building this rich world and implementing gameplay mechanics into that to let you form your own idea of what's going on. You can just cherry pick these symbols and information going on around you. Frankly, I didn't actually like Little Nightmares 2 that much from a plot point, but I'm just saying other people did. I felt like it was just going through the illusion of having a plot. However, I think Shadow of the Colossus, for example, is another great example of they just show you a plot. Again, I think there's barely any spoken dialogue in that game. It's been a while since I played it, but it's actually got a really effective story that you go through and draw your own conclusions from. And that's because this world has been so richly thought out. I think the developers did have a plot in mind. They just felt like they don't need to tell you it. In fact, telling you that there was a plot for Shadow of the Colossus probably would have taken you out of your immersion. Silent Hill is another good example where, again, it's not so much of a fixed plot as something that you can just piece together from little snippets of information that the game gives you. That game's got an amazing environment. They've really integrated these world-building, if you like, story kind of snippets, these tiny windows into the story that's going on, but they've completely integrated that into the visuals, the gameplay. The whole world is telling this story. That said, there's also a lot of games now with a lot of user-generated content, commissioning third-party content, and that is also keeping the world alive. Curious about other people's opinions on that. So does Roblox, Minecraft, VRChat, or even Fortnite, do they have strong world building now just because of the sheer amount of user-generated content being put into them? If you have an opinion on that, or anything else, you can join the conversation by tagging us at the Gentleland on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. We're also on Facebook and LinkedIn at Gentleland, and you can send your questions or comments about the show by email to us at podcast@gentleland.net.
I think at some point, all three of us have had game worlds that we like or don't like, are very memorable or don't. So if you've got any favorite video game worlds that you want to share with us, please let us know either by email or on social media. The Legend of Zelda series, specifically with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, have been really exciting developments in world building for me personally. As I started off earlier in this episode saying how The Legend of Zelda was this very rudimentary world building in this very flat gameplay architecture, and now we have a really complex 3D architecture and engineering that allows us to build different things and have weapons that break and have these really immersive worlds that we can climb mountains and explore. I played the original Legend of Zelda on the Nintendo Entertainment System, A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo, Ocarina of Time on the N64, and I kind of skipped out on a whole bunch of other Legend of Zelda games until I got to Breath of the Wild. And it's interesting to me how the devs kept adding to the canon of the story, like the storyline. I wasn't really sure if they really knew what they were doing, but also at the same time, they're geniuses, they're talented, so they clearly do have an understanding of what the world building is. I don't really care too much about the storyline, but my hypothesis was that they were trying to find new and novel ways to introduce a game design mechanic, and they felt that game design mechanic maybe didn't fit within that world of that storyline. So they just, like you said, Edwin, just released a parallel timeline and started to move things around. And who cares where things really fit in as long as, you were having fun. Really, when you look at like Breath of the Wild, it doesn't look or feel like any other Zelda game that's come before it.
Honestly, Sam, I think you're really onto something because I feel like world building doesn't just happen through storylines, it happens through the way the game plays. Mechanics should reinforce the world's logic, making every interaction feel natural within its setting. Ever noticing that the best NPCs don't just exist for you? I feel like this also kind of lives in that context where they have their own lives, goals, and struggles, and that sometimes even means their own storylines that you maybe never experience, whether you interact with them or not.
Now that we have AI, and I know it's a dirty word, we could really scale up the amount of stuff that you don't have to interact with in a game that just exists because it's there for the sake of it, to tell you that there is a large world happening around you. So we were talking about Skyrim's, I looked it up, there's 337 books with about 318,000 words in them. We were talking about those earlier. There's quite an entertaining video review of all of these books, and it concluded that about 59 of them made good fiction books. When I played Skyrim, I'd occasionally pause to read a book, but the main thing that they did for me was just imply that there's a massive depth and breadth of lore. Like, okay, this world has books, it's got literacy, they write about stuff. I recognize some of the words being used. It also fleshed out the feeling of character progression to have these skill books in the game, and that implies that you aren't just randomly getting better at your skills, but you're actually learning new techniques or getting new knowledge, especially for something like alchemy or smithing. Like, there's actually stuff your player character is discovering, even if you're not aware of it, as they get better at these skills. I thought that was pretty cool. That's a cool effect of having these skill books around alongside other books. I really don't think the average Skyrim player is even going to read a quarter of the books that they found, but that's just my point of this show don't tell. These books exist for the sake of existing, and it's actually very effective. Other games do that pretty well as well. Like, I am certain I haven't read all of my Pokédex entries or whatever. It's just there to tell you that decisions have been made, things have been thought out, there is a rich world happening. I'd just warn anybody listening, please don't make massive scale and then force players to go through it. Skyrim would be awful if you actually had to read all of those books. A game like No Man's Sky was heavily criticized for all of these characterless, procedurally generated worlds where the gameplay loop made you go through them. I've never played the game, but it's been improved a huge amount apparently, so by all means check it out. But on launch, that was heavy criticism of the game.
I like worlds that react to you when a world isn't just, like static. And I know, for example, like GTA, when you can make enemies with one faction and friends with another, and then the environment kind of changes and like certain areas of the game become more hostile to you. And this feeling when reputation really matters, or when your choices change the world. I feel like a lot of visual novels do that quite well. It's kind of when a world acknowledges your existence, even in really small ways. Sometimes you see just in your player apartment certain furniture change based on your decisions. It makes it feel more real.
I'm always reminded of the amount of games being released and available to play. I mean, it's just exploded since the early days of gaming. And it's hard as a player sometimes to ask myself why. Like, why is a player dressed like that? Why are these power-ups named the way that it is? Does this mossy statue have a backstory? It seems sometimes that world building has become a staple in game development, and I'm glad because it seems to be a creative glue that holds together the premise of the game together. It has to serve game design, and I think all of us agree, all of our listeners also agree. It's especially meaningful when the world building doesn't force itself on you, that it's just a part of the atmosphere or the immersiveness of the gameplay. When it's done well, it makes the game more believable than just being cheap theatrics.
That's what I love about good world building. Something like a crumbling, distant monument, overgrown, it just sparks your imagination and it just tells you there's a lot more of this. Even if there isn't, if it's done well, you only need a few of those moments and the player just thinks like, oh, it's a rich world with all of these hidden secrets. And like maybe it's like the one of only 2 crumbling monuments in the whole game. I was reading online that some people feel this is about trust. The developers of the game trust players to notice these details, And you could argue that the players need to incentivize the developers to put them in, and the developers need to incentivize players to find these details. But also the developers need to trust the players to interpret these things and let their imagination fill in the gaps. And then the players need to trust that the devs are actually going to put interesting stuff in hidden corners of the game, even if they don't feel like looking for it in a specific playthrough.
No amount of technology will ever replace the most important part of world building. It's not just trust, it's also creating the space that makes the player believe in it. And the most memorable worlds aren't the biggest or most detailed or most dramatic. They are the ones that stick with us because we believe in them.
So it's not about the quantity of lore, it's just about how it's presented, and really the quality of lore. This arrow to a knee speaks volumes about the game, where a guy could have like 20 sentences explaining he got married and all of that, but Arrow to Knee gets so elegantly straight to the point that they want to tell you about their game world. The best games don't force these worlds on you, they just invite you to explore them. Whether it's books, cues, world building, the game just comes alive in these cases. And it's a collaboration between the developer and the player. It's a shared effort to bring this world alive, and when it's done well, it's unforgettable.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening to us today. We really appreciate you joining us. We'll see you next time.